Imagine walking into a bookstore today and picking up a novel about a woman who rejects a marriage proposal, leaves her husband, speaks openly about sex, commits adultery, questions whether the life that society has planned for her is enough for her. You may probably won't think twice before picking up such a book. In fact, many of these women are now taught in classroom, celebrated as literary icons and praised for their complexity. But when they first appeared, they were considered dangerous. Not because they murdered anyone, not because they were villains, but because they dared to imagine a life beyond what society believed what a woman could be. A woman who enjoyed authority over her husbands, a queen who hungered for political power, a wife who no longer dreamed about domestic duty, a mother who walked out the door, a young woman who wanted her own room, a girl who couldn't force herself into the perfect life that everyone around her expected her to live. Each of these women belonged to a different century, different countries, different authors, different religions, different cultures, and different social classes. Yet they all shared a same fate. They shocked their readers when they first appeared. Some were mocked, some were condemned, some led to censorship, public outrage, and obscenity trials. Others became symbol of moral decay in society. Newspaper reviews and literary critics went after them. But here's the question that always fascinated me. Were these women truly controversial, or were they simply born centuries too early? Because when we read these books today, it's easy to forget. Because when we read these books today, it's easy to forget that we are reading them in the 21st century. We admire Elizabeth Bennet's independence. We sympathize with Hester Prynne. We understand Nora's decision to leave. We see Esther Greenwood struggle with compassion rather than judgment. But the first readers didn't. To understand why these characters cause such outrage, we have to forget everything we think we know about the society and we have to step back into the world that created them. A world where marriage was women's destiny, a world where obedience was considered a virtue, where ambition in a man was admirable, but in a woman it was the biggest sin that she could do. This isn't simply the history of English literature, it is the history of society itself. Because every era has its ideal woman. Every era fears the woman who refused to become that idealized version. So today we are traveling across centuries, nearly 7 centuries of literature, from medieval England to 20th century America, to the women who challenged the world long before it was ready for them. And in doing so, we will discover the most controversial women literature has ever seen. And they were never just fictional characters, they were warnings, they were revolutions, and sometimes they were prophecies. And before I get on with the video, I have something very special to share. We just crossed 100 subscribers on YouTube, and I'm genuinely so thankful for every single one who have subscribed to my channel. When I started this, I didn't expect any of it. I expected like maybe 10 subscriber, out of which 6 were my own accounts, if I'm being honest. And every single person who comments and who likes my video, I'm so thankful, and I'm so grateful for every single one of you. Yeah, bus. That's it. Before I start with the video, I want to share what the incident that later basically became the inspiration behind this video. We were reading the Canterbury Tales in college, and after we were done reading the text, we were assigned an activity. Basically, we have to create like a character card sort of a thing for for one of our characters from which we chose from the journal prologue, and I chose the wife of Bath. And instead of thinking of her as someone immoral or someone who is manipulative or someone indecent, I thought of her like an entrepreneur or an earlier version of the feminist icon. Like basically that's what I wrote, that she was one of the earliest feminist icon. And when I went to submit it in the department, a debate started amongst the professor, because though technically my analysis wasn't wrong, if we judge these characters according to Chaucer or through Chaucer's time, she wasn't exactly a positive character. She was quite satirical in the way that Chaucer tried to interpret her. or try to demonstrate such type of women. And the debate which basically started among professors was that whether students should be allowed to judge a character based on the modern times, or should they also be forced to think about the character from the eyes of the society for which they were written. And both the sides had some brilliant points. Like, it was really difficult to pick a side. That on the one hand we have that, literature is a reflection of society, so we should be judging the character according to the society that was written. And on the other, it was that society keeps on changing, and hence our interpretation, and everyone is free to interpret them however they like. Both equally valid and equally strong points. And though there was not a concrete conclusion that at least we, the students, got, but still it remained in my mind that how many female characters were there in literature who were written as some sort of a warning, or some sort of satire, or some sort of like a negative portrayal of what a woman could become if she was given power and education, versus how we treat them today. Like, a lot of these women have become the foundation of feminist theory in literature. And hence this idea for the video was born, and I just went through my home collection and I scavenged through all of it to find characters who I think could have been controversial. Then I went on the net and I read some research papers. I talked to a few of my professors, and well, here's the video. We imagine medieval Europe, we think of castles, knights, and cathedrals. Yet, beneath all of this romantic image was a society that was built on rigid hierarchies. God ruled over the kings, kings ruled over their subjects, and men ruled over their households. And women were expected to be obedient daughters, faithful wives, and pious mothers. Education for women was rare. Property belonged to men. Marriage was less about romance and more about family alliances, and the ideal woman was quiet and submissive. And then, sometime in the late 14th century, a pilgrim was seemed determined to ignore every single one of those expectations. She was married for 5 times. She openly discussed sex. She argued with men using Bible. She admitted that she enjoyed having authority over her husbands, and perhaps the most shocking of all, she wasn't ashamed of any of it. And this was the wife of Bath, the one for me who started it all. When readers first encountered her in Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, she was the most different woman till now written. She was loud, witty, experienced, and unapologetically confident. Chaucer surrounds her with humor and satire, inviting readers to laugh at her exaggerated contradictions. Yet, beneath that comedy was something a bit unsettling. It was a woman who refused to be silent in a world that demanded. For many medieval thinkers, the wife of Bath represented the exact kind of women that moralists warned against. Sermons of the period often portrayed outspoken wives as threats to the proper order of society. Female sexuality was something to be controlled and not celebrated. Marriage was supposed to be a place where husband was the authority, not turn him into one of the subjects of his wife's story. Today, however, our reaction is almost opposite. Modern readers really see her as a villain. Instead, they view her as one of literature's earliest and most fascinating female voices, a woman who, despite all her flaws, insisted on telling her own story in an age where women were spoken for by someone else. And this shift tells us something. The wife of Bath herself has not changed at all. We as a society have changed. And that exact pattern is what we are going to see again and again throughout this. We will see women who shocked society and centuries later became one of literature's most admired character. The wife of Bath challenged one of the oldest expectations placed upon a woman, that they should be silent and obedient. But nearly 2 centuries later, literature introduced a woman who threatened something far greater than society. She threatened power itself. By the time we reach the 17th century, England has changed dramatically. The medieval world was far gone and we were way into the Renaissance. New ideas about politics, kingship, religion, human nature, they all were reshaping our society. But one belief that remained consistent was political authority belonged to men. A woman's influence was expected to remain private and exercised quietly within the home. Public ambition, especially the desire for power, was considered unnatural. A woman who sought authority over men was seen as unfeminine and threat to natural order itself. And within this world, Shakespeare introduced one of the most infamous women, Lady Macbeth. I have already made a video going into detail if you're interested with that, but for this, what's fascinating is that Lady Macbeth doesn't commit a sort of violence. She doesn't kill Duncan, she doesn't do anything. Instead, she does something that Shakespeare's audience found quite new, quite unsettling. She persuades. She questions Macbeth's courage. She mocks his masculinity and pushes him towards a crime he was hesitant to commit. In one of the most chilling moments in the play, she calls upon the spirits to unsex her, asking to be stripped of the qualities which made her a woman so that she can pursue power without compassion or hesitation. To the Jacobean audience, this wasn't just merely shocking, it was deeply symbolic. Lady Macbeth rejected every role that society has assigned to women. She crossed boundaries between masculine and feminine, private and public, and influence and authority. It is no surprise that for centuries, Lady Macbeth became a shorthand for dangerous women, ambitious, manipulative, and morally corrupt. But modern readers understand something different. Today, critics are just as likely to discuss her intelligence, psychological complexity, and the crushing burden of guilt that ultimately destroys her, rather than reducing her down to one dimensional villain. Many see her as a character trapped within a world where ambition in men was celebrated but was condemned in women. And I think a pattern is now beginning to emerge. The wife of Bath was criticized because she claimed authority within the marriage, and Lady Macbeth was feared because she reached beyond the household and into the realm of politics. The setting has changed, the century has changed, and even the type of ambition has changed. But society's anxieties remain remarkably familiar. The question is no longer whether a woman should speak. Now it is whether a woman should be allowed to seek power. If you have spent any time on Book Talk or BookTube, you would have heard this recommendation again and again that if you want the blueprint of romance, read Pride and Prejudice. This is also one of my current reads. I'm rereading it for college. And today, Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy are considered one of the greatest love story that literature has given. Their relationship inspired countless novels, film, and even brooding heroes of modern romance. In many ways, Darcy is described as the original emotionally unavailable love interest long before dark romance became a publishing phenomena. But if we only read Pride and Prejudice as a romance, we might miss what Elizabeth Bennet had made remarkable. When Jane Austen published this novel in 1813, Britain was a society in which marriage was often a woman's greatest source of financial security. A respectable woman was expected to marry well, preserve her family's reputation, and avoid challenging the social conviction. And Elizabeth ends up doing the opposite. She refuses to marry for convenience. She rejects Mr. Collins, even though accepting him would have secured her a future and protected her family from financial uncertainty. Later, she rejects Mr. Darcy's first proposal, despite his wealth and social standing, because she refused to marry a man who she neither respects nor understands. To a modern reader, these decisions seems obvious that why would I marry someone like that? And the entire redemption arc is there now in modern times. But for the women of the Regency era, this was unimaginable. Elizabeth wasn't revolutionary because she wanted to overthrow the society. She was revolutionary because she believed that her own happiness mattered. Jane Austen didn't just write a heroine who dreamed of ruling kingdoms or abandoning civilizations. She wrote something far subtle and perhaps a lot more radical. A woman who believes that love without respect is not enough. And 2 centuries later, Elizabeth Bennet still feels modern. While readers may come across Pride and Prejudice expecting one of literature's greatest romances, they often leave remembering something else. A heroine who insisted that choosing her own future is the greatest act of independence. If Elizabeth's journey was so striking for the society, the next woman is something far more dangerous. She lived outside marriage altogether. By this time, we have reached the middle of the 19th century. We leave Regency England and arrived in Puritan New England, a society not only governed not just by law but by religion. Every aspect of life was measured against religious morality, and a few sins were considered far more serious than adultery. Public punishment was not just about justice, it was about making an example. Shame was meant to be visible and permanent. And in this world, Nathaniel Hawthorne introduces Hester Prynne. From the very first chapter, Hester has been judged. She stands on a scaffold before the entire town with her infant daughter in her arm, forced to wear a scarlet letter A embroidered on her dress, a symbol intended to mark her as an adulteress for the rest of her life. The townspeople expected her to break. They expected guilt, repentance, and then silence. Instead, Hester does something radical. She survives. She refused to give the identity of Pearl's father despite the immense pressure. She raised her daughter alone and supports herself through her own work and slowly earns respect of the community that once wanted nothing more than to exile her. This is where the Scarlet Letter becomes more than a story about adultery. It becomes a story about hypocrisy. A Hearthstone asks a question that still feels uncomfortable today. What is the greater sin? Breaking society's rules or creating a society that allows no room for compassion? When this novel was published, it was 1850. The novel was widely read and was a commercial success, but its theme of adultery, female sexuality, religious hypocrisy also made it controversial. In the years that followed, it would be challenged and removed from some schools, libraries because of its subject matters. Yet, modern readers really remember Hester as a sinner. We remember her as someone resilient. The Scarlet Letter was supposed to symbolize the shame and has over time become to symbolize strength. And once again, we see that pattern repeating. The society wanted Hester to become a warning, but the history remembered her as a survivor. Every woman we have met so far has been defined with a single act that frightened the society. The wife of Bath spoke too freely, Lady Macbeth desired power, Elizabeth Bennet refused to settle, and Hester Prynne proved that women could endure society's judgment without allowing it to define what kind of woman was she. And perhaps the greatest irony is this: the people inside the novel never stopped to look at the Scarlet Letter, but the readers 2 centuries later have learned to look beyond it. And if the Hester Prynne was punished for breaking society's rules, the next women did something far more radical than this. She questioned whether rules could ever make her happy. By the middle of 19th century, Europe was changing rapidly. Industrialization was transforming cities, middle class was expanding, and the novel became one of the most popular form of entertainment. It was no longer about kings and heroes, but for ordinary people, their marriages, dreams, disappointment had become a part of literature. And in this world stepped Emma Bovary. Unlike the women we have discussed so far, Emma isn't fighting for political power or for public recognition. She is not trying to change the world that she lives in. She just wants a life that feels extraordinary. Raised in the sentiments of romance novel, Emma dreams of a grand love, luxury, elegance, and consistent excitement. Instead, she marries Charles Bovary, a kind and painfully ordinary doctor. What follows is not a dramatic tragedy in Shakespearean sense, but something perhaps far more familiar: boredom. Emma believes that somewhere beyond the quiet provincial life lies happiness that she has always imagined. She seeks it through affairs, expensive purchases, and fantasies of glamorous existence. But every escape leaves her far more dissatisfied than before. Today, Emma is often described as literature's most complex anti heroines. Some readers sympathize with her longing, yet others criticize her selfishness. Yet almost everyone agrees that she felt remarkably modern. When Madame Bovary was published in 1857, however, many readers saw something completely different. The outrage wasn't simply that Emma have committed adultery. Literatures have portrayed immoral characters long before. The real scandal was that Gustav Flaubert, the writer, refused to write a simple moral lesson. He presented Emma with psychological depth, allowing readers to understand her desire instead of reducing her down to one dimensional villain. And that decision had real consequences. The Flaubert was taken to court on the charges of offending public morality and religion. Prosecutors have argued that the novel glorified adultery and corrupted the masses because it portrayed Emma's inner life with such realism. Although Flaubert was ultimately acquitted, the trial transformed Madame Bovary into one of the most famous literary controversies of the 19th century. Ironically, the very realism that scandalized the reader also made it timeless today. Emma Bovary doesn't represent evil. She presents the expectation that marriage would solve loneliness, that wealth would create happiness, and that romance should resemble fiction. And perhaps that's why modern readers continue to return to her story. Emma isn't destroyed simply because she makes bad choices. She is destroyed because she spends her entire life chasing an illusion that society and the novels that she loved helped create. And by the end of the 19th century, something remarkable had happened. The literature had already given us women who spoke too loudly, who desired too much, who loved the wrong people, and questions the life that society chose for them. But something remained. What happens when a woman doesn't just question the society? What happens when she decides to leave it? And this question was answered in A Doll's House. This play was premiered in 1879, written by Ibsen. Europe was changing at that time. Conversation about women's education, property rights, legal identity were becoming increasingly common. Yet, despite these changes, the ideal wife was still expected to be selfless, obedient, devoted, not just to her husband but to her children as well. A woman's identity was defined by her family. Her duty came before the individuality, and then we meet Nora Helmer. At first glance, she appears to be the perfect Victorian wife. She is cheerful, playful, and is devoted to her husband Torvald. He affectionately calls her names like my little skylark, my little squirrels, and nicknames that still sound loving, but reveal that how little he sees her as an individual. As the play unfolds, discover that Nora has been secretly committing forgery to save her husband's life. Ironically, this act that society would condemn was motivated by love. She believed that when truth will come out, Torvald would stand beside her. And instead, he worries about his own reputation. And that moment, Nora realizes something devastating: that she has spent her entire marriage performing the role of a perfect wife rather than living as an independent human. And this final scene was completely different and controversial for itself. Nora walks out of the house, leaves her husband, leaves her children, and slams the door shut behind. This ending had shocked the viewers. In 1879, this was explosive. Audiences were outraged. Many critics accused Ibsen of attacking the institution of marriage. Some theaters refused to perform this original ending, and Ibsen reluctantly wrote an alternative version, a version where Nora says, a version that he described as barbaric outrage. The sound of closing door was known as door slam heard around the world. What made Nora so controversial wasn't simply that she left, but why she left in the first place. She had duties to herself that were just as important as the duties to her family. The single idea challenged centuries of societal expectation. Nora Helmer ended up asking a far more radical question. What if marriage itself was the thing that was preventing women from discovering who she is? For many of the 19th century readers, this was almost unthinkable, while for the modern readers, it feels like a conversation that is unfolding today, especially with the marriage and childbirth rates plummeting in almost every country. And perhaps that's the dollhouse's greatest achievement. It didn't just tell us a controversial story, it changed the kinds of story that literature was allowed to tell. After Nora had walked out the door, literature has crossed an invisible threshold. For centuries, writers had imagined women struggling against the expectation of their societies. Some resisted quietly, while others rebelled openly, and almost all these stories had one thing common: women asking for what they wanted. And in 1929, one writer decided to ask a very different question. Why had so few women been able to tell their own stories in first place? And this writer was Virginia Woolf. Unlike the other works that I have discussed so far, A Room of One's Own isn't just a novel. It's a series of lectures that were delivered to women students at Cambridge before becoming one of the most influential works of literary criticisms ever written. Woolf wasn't interested in proving that women lacked talent. She believed the opposite. Her argument was that the history has denied women the conditions necessary to develop that talent. She famously wrote, a woman must have money and a room of her own if she wants to write fiction. At first glance, this seems that she's talking about the architecture, a room, a four wall, a desk, a physical space. But the room is actually more of a metaphor. The room represents independence, privacy, education, economic freedom, the ability to think without interruptions. Because for centuries, many women didn't possess these things. To explain this, Woolf imagines one of the most famous fictional character in literary history, Judith Shakespeare, the equally gifted sister of William Shakespeare. Judith is every bit as brilliant as her brother. But while William was sent to school, Judith stayed at home. While William was writing plays, she was expected to prepare for marriage. While William was busy finding opportunities, she was finding locked doors. The point wasn't that she existed. The point was that countless women like her did exist. That were histories only remembered the works that were written. It cannot remember the masterpieces that society never allowed to exist. And this is where everything we have discussed suddenly comes together. Today, Woolf's ideas are taught at universities across the world and have become foundation of feminist theories in literary criticism. But in 1929, her argument challenged the literary canon itself. She dared to suggest that absence of great women writer wasn't evidence of inferior talent, but it was evidence of unequal opportunity. That single idea changed the way we look at society itself. Because after Woolf, the question was no longer why are these women so controversial, but it rather became what kind of world created a woman like that, and what stories have we lost because so many has never gotten the chance to write them. After Woolf, it would have been easier to believe that the story were moving towards a happy ending. Women were entering universities at great numbers. They were publishing novels. They were pursuing careers that previous generation could scarcely imagine. On paper, a Rome of one's own finally began to exist. So, why did so many women still feel trapped? And that question brings us to our final work, The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. When Sylvia Plath published The Bell Jar in 1963, the world looked very different than that of Wife of Bath and Nora Helmer. Women had gained rights that earlier generations couldn't dream of. And beneath that progression laid another problem, the one which was far less visible. The pressure to be the perfect daughter, perfect student, perfect wife, perfect mother, perfect woman. At the center of this novel is Esther Greenwood, a brilliant, ambitious young woman who appears to have everything that society tells her that she should want. So she wins scholarships, she earns prestigious universities, and has a promising future ahead of her. But instead of feeling fulfilled, she feels suffocated. Plath captures this feeling through one of the most haunting metaphors in literature, the bell jar. Esther describes living as though she has been trapped beneath a bell jar and she sees the world around her yet is unable to fully participate in it. Everything feels disoriented and every possibility becomes another impossible choice. What makes the bell jar so powerful is that Esther's greatest struggle isn't simply depression, it's identity. She wants a career, she wants love, she wants freedom, but she is consistently told that she must choose one version of her at the expense of all other. And the novel's one of the most memorable image is that of a fig tree. Esther imagines her life as a fig tree full of figs, each fig representing a different life. A writer, a professor, a wife, a traveler, a mother. She wants it all. But she hesitates, unable to choose, and the figs become to shrivel and fall to the ground. One of literature's most heartbreaking representation of the fear of choosing one's future means losing every other possibility. When the bell jar was first published, many readers found its frank discussion of mental illness, female ambition, and the dissatisfaction deeply unsettling. Over the years, it also has been challenged and removed from school libraries because of its treatment of suicide, depression, and sexuality. Today, however, Esther Greenwood has become one of literature's most recognizable voices. Readers no longer see her as simply troubled young woman. They see her as someone trying to navigate the impossible expectation. In many ways, Esther is the culmination of every single woman we have met in this video. Like the wife of Bath, she refuses to let others define her. Like Lady Macbeth, she possesses the ambition. Like Elizabeth Bennet, she wants to choose her own future. Like Hester Prynne, she carries the weight of society's judgment. Like Emma Bovary, she discovers that fantasy and reality really align. Like Nora Helmer, she asks whether life that is expected of her is enough. And like Virginia Woolf, she understands that freedom means very little if you cannot discover who you are within it. Our journey began with a woman who dared to speak in 14th century, and it ends with a woman who 600 years later is still asking one question, that if society has that gives me freedom to choose, then why does every choice still feels like a prison? And that is why the bell jar continues to resonate with the readers, because it reminds us that the greatest battles are not always fought in courtrooms or in battlefields. Sometimes they are fought quietly inside the human mind. And that's all I have for this video. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for watching this. And if you have anything to add to the video, or you feel like I have missed anything, make sure let me know in the comments down below. Thank you.